This lecture introduces African art, beginning with the earliest remnants that we have of civilizations on the continent, with Sub-Saharan civilizations being our focus today. Africa, as the Americas, is geographically and culturally diverse, with more than 1,000 African languages spoken today. The regions in Africa range from deserts, tropical rainforests, grasslands, and mountains. Obviously, each one of these terrains will yield a very different culture, a very different way of life, and of course, a different type of art. If we are to show a satellite view of Africa, you can easily see the deserts in the north, the Sudan or the grass belt in the center with a rainforest at the heart of the continent, the Congo, and grasslands to the far south. If we overlay another of these images, we can see more clearly exactly where these bands of heat, dryness, and wetness actually are going to be located, thus giving rise to very different civilizations of either hunters, herdsmen, farmers, and or cattlemen today. The civilization of ancient Egypt that thrived between 3500 and 525 BCE when it fell to the Persians would exploit the regions, especially to the south in Nubia and in Sudan, for their natural resources, specifically their gold reserves. The Greeks and Phoenicians as well would colonize North Africa as seen here, especially with the cities of Carthage and Leptis, and would extend the trading routes between 1000 and 300 BCE, so that Africa became one of the main trading ports for the Mediterranean Sea. The Romans took control of these trade routes in 300 BCE at the end of the Punic Wars, when Carthage is going to try to upend and become dominant as far as the culture in the Mediterranean. The Romans took over and thus made North Africa a Roman area and controlled by them as well. In the 7th and 8th century Common Era, the rise of Islam would spread very rapidly. Beginning in the Middle East, it spreads westward in North Africa until 1475 as seen here. It is the dominant cultural force. In fact, until the 19th century, it remains the dominant outside influence in Africa before we have massive colonization from Western empires and thus Christianity. It was here that Islamic scholars, not Western scholars, would chronicle these West African empires like Ghana, Mali, Songhai. In East Africa, we have maritime trade, beginning in the 1st century with Indonesia in the South China Sea. The language that is so commonly associated with Africa, Swahili, is actually born from a combination of Arabic and Bantu-speaking Africans. Thus, the influence of Islam cannot be understated in the development of Africa. The Western discovery, if you will, as it was called, by the Portuguese, that lasted periodically between 1415 and 88, is the result of this culture searching for trade routes to India, much as the story we are told of Christopher Columbus. Attempting to understand the history of this continent is difficult, for there is a lack of systematic archaeological research that has been conducted. In fact, our knowledge is limited to the past 100 years. This is compounded by the fact that African cultures primarily produced works made of wood, and so they do not survive in great abundance. What we need to do today is to extrapolate from contemporary traditions and oral histories of the peoples that are still in Africa, still surviving and practicing these traditions and still keeping these cultures alive today, in order to understand what they were like in the past. Now, Africa is the cradle of civilization because modern humans are going to evolve from this area and move out into Western Europe and Asia. It is here that we find tool making that precedes art by 3 million years in this instance. The earliest evidence that we have of a human settlement comes by way of the south tip of Africa in Blombos Cave from around 75,000 BCE, or 77,000 years ago. Here we find that this site predates all others by 30,000 years and gives us the earliest remnants of Homo sapiens sapiens. The blocks that we find here with geometric patterns show us distinctly that these are peoples that are different than the Neanderthals and the other Homo sapiens that develop alongside our ancestors. Here we have different tools, spearheads, and jewelry as seen off to the right, where shells are going to be pierced so they can be placed on a necklace. Apollo 11 cave is going to give us the transition, as we understand it, from a recognition of objects in the natural world to representation or presenting them again. Notably, the facts and the finds that we have in Blombos cave do not show or attempt to transform the materials that humans are using to look like something else like in the outside world, such as an animal or a human. The small portable objects that come along first at Apollo 11 cave are by way of stone plaques. These stone plaques are going to show the most dominant subject of early man, and that's going to be animals in strict profile. So here we have animal facing left from the Apollo 11 cave in Namibia from 23,000 BCE. And like later examples that would spread into Western Europe, we find that we have a quadruped seen from the side. This would be carried on by the peoples that left the continent and would expand to massive murals such as those seen in Lascaux Cave or that at Chauveau. Here we have the same type of composite view with animals seen in profile but showing all four legs. This would be a common motif throughout the Paleolithic period. Like their relatives in the north, the peoples in North Africa would also find shelter in caves and overhanging rock formations, and this is where some of the earliest murals or artworks are going to be found. At Tassili-Nangers in Algiers, we find in the mountains a great example of this, now in the Saharan desert. In fact, rock art is going to be found throughout the continent in the earliest settlements, shelters, and caves, where Homo sapiens sapiens is going to have found residence and safety. Here we find the record of the transformations of the Saharan desert from its original grassland status into the dry, arid features we see today. For originally, we see humans alongside very large animals that required a lot of water and vegetation, such as elephants, hippopotamuses, giraffes, etc. We find that the remnants here are evidence of the changing geography that would lead to this desert-like formation. Here, the dancers in ceremonial attire, which is a section of rock wall painting that we have from around 5,000 to 2000 BCE, shows that these peoples had a great attention to clothing, body decor, and headdresses, so that we can fairly accurately get an idea of what they would have looked like and what they would have worn. Now, what we see as the two figures shown here with other animals is likely a ritual. We do not know a ritual to try to do what, but we have the dominant theories being to ensure rainfall, success in a hunt, or to honor the dead. This is very common in Neolithic civilizations that existed throughout the world at the time. In 4000 BCE, we find that the climate becomes much more arid, and so hunting gives way to herding. So now we see scenes of herding and cattlemen in rock art as they drive their flocks. Depth is going to be shown through overlapping, along with the figural placement, whereas figures and objects that are lower in the picture plane are understood to be closer to the viewer, while those that are higher are further away. This is a standard way to suggest depth that we have on a two-dimensional surface throughout the history of art. Overlapping along with the diminishing of size or the diminution of scale and vertical placement all are going to be critical to understanding large figures and scenes brought together and how they relate to the viewer. In 2500 to 2000 BCE, the Sahara dries up, so the Saharans migrate to Egypt, where similar motifs are going to resurface of people that are going to be driving and caring for cattle, as well as other people riding chariots. The Egyptians adopt this because many of the peoples become workers and artisans in Egypt. They also migrate south to the Sudan, also taking their traditions and their animal husbandry with them. Therefore, Sudanese agriculture is going to develop around 3000 BCE while this transition is happening in the northern desert. It was here that we find, at the same time as the rise of civilization in Mesopotamia, that the peoples in this area were able to produce enough food to accommodate and to feed a large population, and also to raise cattle. In 500 BCE, this is followed upon by the Iron Age in Africa, where iron weapons are going to be used in order to take over larger areas, as well as producing farming tools. Thus, we have larger societies, and of course, the technology can feed more people because we can plow more fields, we can protect ourselves and gain more territory by way of the technology that is available to us throughout history. As impressive as these accomplishments are, they do not leave behind many cultural artifacts or anything relating to material culture. For that, we must turn to one of the earliest civilizations that provides us with a glimpse into the cultural practices of their peoples, the Nok culture. The Nok culture in Sudan and Nigeria existed between 1000 BCE and 300 Common Era. They are going to live by way of agriculture and animal husbandry as those in the Sudan. And they produce the earliest Sub-Saharan sculpture between 500 BCE and 200 Common Era. They are going to be farmers. We find large areas of cultivated fields, and they produce grain and oil-bearing seeds, as well as smelters. We also discovered furnaces by way of these massive pits that they would use in order to smelt different types of ore. We know that floods are going to expose, drag and roll and scratch and break these terracotta figures, but they bring them to the surface, and thus, of course, they bring them to our attention quite recently. These were produced between 500 and 200 BCE. These figures, such as the head seen here from the Nok culture, are over life size and originally would have been full length. So you would have had an over life size figure head to toe. Here we have the figure of a woman who is going to be frontally facing, mouth open, nostrils flaring, and eyes hollowed out, with 3 sections of the hair pulled up, much as we would find today in this area in Nigeria. The head and the attire give us, as in the earlier rock art, an indication as to the decoration and the appearance of these peoples. And so we find that the remnants are very, very important for not only art history, but for history, archaeology, and anthropology as well. The triangular D-shaped eyes are quite specific to the Nok culture. They would hollow out the pupils and the nostrils so that when firing this terracotta, the air could pass through these areas, and thus, of course, it could dry more evenly and rapidly. Now, what is interesting is, after finding these sculptures, seemingly for Europeans and American scholars, it confirmed the belief that Africans could only produce abstract, non-naturalistic sculpture and art, thus showing that the European tradition that gave us the classical era in antiquity and the Renaissance are superior because they can make things that are more naturalistic. Near the city of Nok, we have Igbo Ukwu in Nigeria, which around 800 Common Era provides us with the earliest bronze casting that we have in Africa, in an elite burial site with a shrine complex in Sub-Saharan Africa. These early bronzes were found as part of the burial here of a ruler, wearing elaborate regalia in the seated position, surrounded by ivory tusks, imported beads in the necklace, and a bronze leopard skull. The elephants and leopards that surround him are symbols of temporal and spiritual leadership even today in African societies. All of these items, interestingly enough, as is true for most African art in general, are functional. They are going to range from finial staff sculptures to plates to various lamps. Here we have the storehouse sculptures and this excavation showing us the lost wax castings of small bowls, fly whisk handles, and staff finials, that being those decorative elements that are going to top and adorn staffs. They are all going to be designed in this unique style, where we find natural objects are covered with raised banded decorations. Here we have the fly whisk, so common in African art, that is used to shoo away or get rid of flying insects from around oneself out in the open. The lost wax casting technique, as in Western Europe, demands a great deal of understanding of technology, of melting and creating new alloys. You begin with a clay core, in this case covering it with wax and carving with a tool the design that you want to cast. You then add wax rods or drains, as seen here in image C, then cover it with a layer of clay and fine sand in image D. The wax is then drained out after being heated, and molten metal poured into the cast that is left over. The finished cast is then broken by way of the layer of clay and sand, revealing the final substitutive bronze. Here in the storehouse sculpture at Igbo Ukwu, we have, as a finial staff here, this equestrian figure, or a man on a horse, showing on his face ichi, or scarification, which is a symbol of achievement and or rite of passage for these peoples in Nigeria. So they would systematically and consistently scar different parts of their face in different patterns. Along with finial staff decorations, we also have this water pot drum found in the same burial. These very often would be filled with water and then struck with a flat mallet to make a percussive sound. Here are examples of those made of clay and other instruments that are still in use today in Nigeria and the surrounding areas. Turning to the city of Ife, Nigeria, directly to the west, we have a city that is sacred to the Yoruba people, and these are going to thrive around 800 Common Era. They considered the city the navel of the world, the site of creation, where the first Oni or king, this ruler, came down from heaven to create and populate the earth. The Oni is going to set up an ancestral line that continues to this day, unbroken father to son. These rulers are known as Oba, and one is seen here. The art that is commissioned by the Ife rulers is going to be broken down into periods, the first of which is the pavement period, seen here from 1000 to 1400 Common Era. They produced terracotta vessels showing altars in the center of a city, with realistic portraits and abstract elements on either side flanking this realistic portrait. The blessing is going to be central to this portrait that is still practiced by royalty today. You'll notice that the ritual vessel here is broken, for it would have contained ritualistic libations, and like the geometric crater from the Dipylon cemetery in ancient Greece, it would have allowed these alcoholic beverages or libations to flow into the ground to return to the earth, usually for a ritualistic purpose. The portrait head tradition is going to be very important for the Yoruba people and are going to be producing incredibly naturalistic portraits of individual youthful types, especially female. Here we have the crowned head of a Yoruba ruler from Ife, Nigeria. Here from the 12th to the 15th century, made of zinc brass and being just over a life size. We have one that begins producing lifelike heads through the lost wax process just discussed. Leo Frobenius is going to be the archaeologist and the art historian who discovers this type of art in 1910. And he thought upon discovery that it must have been made by the lost island of Atlantis and its people, for it couldn't possibly be African, for it was believed in the early 20th century that African art could only be abstract, and thus, as they called it at the time, primitive, not as impressive and as naturalistic and as technically proficient as Western European artists. This causes us to reevaluate African art when we realize it's from a Nigerian culture, because it is obviously not entirely abstracted. It is very naturalistic, taking into account natural physiognomy or facial features of the people who lived in this region, as well as the practices of ichi and scarification that are still practiced in this area. Here we have parallel scarification patterns that are still commonly carried out as part of the practice of initiation rites and rituals, and of becoming a man, for instance, or moving through different phases of one's life. They are going to be found on both men and women. The same can be seen and found in the finial decoration we discussed a moment ago, also in Nigeria, just to the east. The individual likenesses of modern Yoruban women are also seen here and are going to make us reconsider what African art actually is going to appear as and how it develops. That in fact it is something that can show naturalism and something that is fairly naturalistic. And so we cannot privilege European art above it because of this misunderstanding and how we classify things and rank them as superior artistically. These would be attached to wooden mannequins and then dressed. The holes in the necks are going to be the markers where we would attach these hollow bronze cast sculptures to the wooden core. This is a practice that is found throughout the ancient world. The Athenians, for instance, also have a similar type of decoration for their cult statues, the most famous of which is of Athena on the Parthenon. We have the same age and features, very interestingly enough, found in multiple Yoruba heads. And so these embody the concept of physical perfection for this people, that they are more beautiful than the average person, and that beauty and moral character are going to relate the qualities necessary of a ruler. For in the native tongue of the Ife here and the Yorubans, the great head is the honorific title given to a king. Thus the head leads the body as the king leads the people. This practice of idealizing the features of rulers to show how they are connected to the spiritual world and are divinely sanctioned to rule is one that is common in many cultures, such as the ancient Romans. Augustus, being the first emperor, is going to show himself as such to argue that he should be in charge. Nigeria, in fact, is home to many different cultures from this era who are going to produce many very important works that are significant in tracing the development of African art. Another one is from the city in between Igbo Ukwu and Ife, and that's Benin City. So here at Benin, Nigeria, we have, as far as the story goes, the great Oni, the creator of all here on earth, sends the Oba, the king, from Ife to rule this area. He requests a master metal caster for memorial sculptures to be created and has cast memorial heads of royal ancestors. This is still practiced to this very day, as we still have Oba ruling these cities. The Benin periods are broken up into early, middle, and late. Roughly from the 1400s to 1550, we have, as is attributable to the characteristics, the smallest and most naturalistic approach to these heads. The middle period, from 1550 to 1700, shows larger heads that are more stylized. Notice how attenuated or stretched out the neck and the face is. It also is more abstracted with the eyes and the scarification above the brow. We also find that the beads are going to conceal the chin and neck. Finally, in the late period, from 1700 to 1897, we have an angular stylized form of features with an elaborate beaded crown and horizontal phalanges that flank it. So we find that we are going to move further and further to a stylized approach to portraiture. Only kings could actually commission these works in brass, which is a mixture of copper and zinc in this alloy. This memorial head of an oba is a good example of the early period, produced around the 16th century and is around 9 inches tall. These are the smallest and most naturalistic of these various portrait heads, showing the characteristic physiognomy of Nigerians of this region, with the broad nose, lips, protruding cheeks, large eyes, and then the characteristic coral shell crown and neck piece. These would grow in size and weight as trade with Europe grew, and this civilization became more and more advanced and wealthy from trade with the Portuguese. If we compare this to the Yoruba examples we talked about from Ife, Nigeria, that supposedly shares a common cultural ancestry, we can see how the metal casters from Ife would have been sent to Benin to assist in the Oba in memorializing his ancestors to create sculptures for these altars. The head, remember, is the seat of wisdom. Therefore, as is common to the Benin culture, they would argue that the ability to succeed in this world depends fundamentally on the ruler's ability to communicate with spiritual forces and thus influence the world around him. Wealth in the civilization came from trade with Portugal that took place from 1485 onward, and was the primary way in which ivory and slaves were taken from Africa by the Portuguese slave traders. So these individuals in Nigeria traded off their fellow Africans. It would not be until 1897 when British troops sacked and burned the royal palace. The Oba at this time went into exile and remained so until World War I in 1914. The sack was a reprisal for trade negotiators being massacred on a holy day, a poor misunderstanding and misinterpretation between these two cultures. The shrines, like this one, were taken as war booty and split up and sold off piecemeal. Here we have a photograph of them reassembled as they would have originally appeared, with the portraits in the center as well as the ivory tusks representing power flanking them off to the side. So just as we have in the earliest examples of the Yoruba culture, the Ifa in Nigeria, in this pot, with an altar with a head flanked by abstract objects that is broken, we see that carried out here in life in what would have actually been in existence. So the elephant tusks as symbols of power also represent the royal power of the Oba, who is ruling over these people. The Obas would also commission ivory carving, such as this hip pendant representing the Queen Mother, or Ioba. So the Ioba is the Oba's mother and is the senior female at court. This small object, which is of course just under an inch tall, would be worn at the hip. The crown is going to be different from the early coral crown seen in the memorial head of the Oba here from the 16th century, around the same time, because we're going to have the same features of those individuals who lived at this time, but also with carefully rendered regalia and jewelry that she's wearing, of course showing us how significant she is. Here, we're going to find the scarification patterns are now on her forehead instead of the striations throughout the form itself. The crown is actually made up of Portuguese heads with alternating mudfish, represented by Olokun, who is the lord of the great waters, for instance. The necklace below show heads of Portuguese soldiers with beads and flowing hair. The mudfish that is represented by this god lives near water and mediates between each one of them, between water and land, just as the Oba, and this is the mother of the Oba, we must remember, mediates between the human and the supernatural world. So we can see the significance that this ruler has. They are our connection as a people here in Benin, from our world to the supernatural one. We also find, along with these portraits in Benin, 900 brass plaques on the royal palace walls. Here we have the warrior chief flanked by warriors and attendants from Benin City. This is produced between 1550 and 1650 and made of brass, about 14 inches tall and 15 inches wide. This lost wax casting shows in this relief sculpture the memorial and the ceremony of the chief with his warriors and all of the appropriate accoutrement and regalia that they would wear. The foliate patterned background is going to be flattening out the forms that do not allow us to move into the background, but instead push all of the space up to the front, as we have a heraldic device with a central figure frontally facing, flanked by 4 other figures, all of them in bilateral symmetry. The head seen here is of woven coral for the crown and the neck piece, in this instance covering all of his head and all of his mouth and neck, we should say. The ceremonial scenes at court are actually going to be what is represented in these 900 plaques that are still carried out today in ceremonies in Benin. The warrior chief in these ceremonies are going to be attired and flanked by 2 warriors, his rank shown by the leopard tooth necklace and the coral decorated cap and collar that he wears. The leopard mask on his hip is going to be similar to that worn in the ivory carving. The portrait carries on the tradition of covering up the neck and chin, as well as the coral crown, seen in the more abstracted versions from the Middle Period. The hip-worn ivory is also going to be a common accoutrement and decoration for these oba. Now, the design of a frontally facing ruler with attendants on either side of him is very akin to the hierarchic approach to icon painting in the West in Christianity, where the most significant and powerful individual, and certainly this includes temporal and spiritual power, is going to be situated in the center of the image, staring directly out at the viewer. In this instance, holding the accoutrement and the symbols of their power in this blade and spear, whereas the others that support this ruler are going to be flanking either side. In this case, he holds an eben, a sword that is leaf-shaped and is made of iron, with an open-work surface decoration. This is the principal symbol of Benin high rank, and is going to still be carried in these ceremonial processions and rituals to this very day. Here we have an example of that central figure flanked by others, and so the design and the decoration remains consistent in Nigeria for centuries here. The hierarchy of scale of the ruler versus the attendants on either side of him is one that is understood throughout the ancient Mediterranean, from Egypt to the Middle East and here in Nigeria, where the more important spiritual and temporal rulers, such as kings, are shown much larger than their attendants or those that are with them. We still see the raising of the sword today to pledge allegiance to the Oba, as seen here in this example, as one of the attendants holds this leaf-shaped blade. The Oba is still going to wear the same regalia, seated on a dais as he would. The attendants as well, you'll notice, are going to wear coral bands around their heads and those decorative elements around their necks. Thus they would cover up their mouths if you build them up ring by ring. Here we find the continued tradition in Nigeria that can be dated back 500 years. Therefore, if we summarize, early African art is going to record portraits of the ruling elite in order to reinforce the divinely mandated order of society, as in Polynesian society, those in the Pacific Northwest, and those of the Maya. Next class, we'll continue with the urban centers in Africa and exporting these ideas to the West.